Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Savitt. I'm glad to welcome you back to the Center for Security Policy for our second webinar of 2021. We took a break last week for inauguration, but for the foreseeable future, this will be a weekly event. You can set a recurring calendar event for Wednesdays at 1 p.m. so you don't miss one. The topics and speakers for upcoming programs will be up about a month ahead of time, so check them out at securefreedom.org under the webinar tab. We have 3 more already booked up, so I'll give you the details on those at the end of the program. Today's program is entitled Outlook for President Biden's National Security Policies After Week 1, featuring our special guests, Niall Gardner and Claudia Rosette, and moderated by CSP President Fred Fleitz. Please note that you are in listen-only mode, but you can submit your text questions in the Q&A box in your GoToWebinar panel, and I will read as many questions as possible for our guests at the end of the program. This event is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/securefreedom, or on our website at securefreedom.org. With that, I'll hand it over to Center's President and CEO, Fred Fleitz.
Hey, Adam, thank you. And thank you all for joining this important discussion where we're going to look at what President Biden's national security policies are going to be after week 1. We have some initial indications. The administration is still staffing up. These policies are still being developed, but we have some pretty strong signs of where Biden will be going in national security. I guess the most important observation I'd like to make, it's one that none of us want to hear, is that elections have consequences. And the election of Joe Biden means that he is throwing out the successful policies of President Trump, his America First policy, which made our nation safe, and reverting to the failed policies of the Obama administration with excessive collaboration with the United Nations and basically giving up our sovereignty to the UN. And I think we've seen a number of indications with some really disturbing statements about priorities, putting climate change above looking at the threat from Iran and Russia and China. So there's real concerns here. And organizations like the Center for Security Policy, we are trying to press the Biden administration to do the right thing, to recognize these threats, to address them. And when they don't, we're going to hold them accountable. It's a role we've played frequently in the past. We consider ourselves a shadow National Security Council, and I think we're making a real difference in doing this. And one other thing I might add, you may have heard that many former Trump officials are being shunned and canceled. The Center's trying to hire some, and we're looking for funding to do this. And Peter Hoekstra, former ambassador to the Netherlands and former House Intelligence Committee chairman, he will be joining our organization as chairman of our advisory board, and we have several other former Trump officials who are going to be joining us. We're not going to be canceled, and we're going to do our small part to make sure the people who did their patriotic duty working for President Trump are not canceled either. I have 2 extraordinary experts to discuss this with today. Claudia Rosette is a foreign policy fellow with the Independent Women's Forum and an award-winning journalist who has reported over the past 37 years from Asia, the former Soviet Union, Latin America, and the Middle East. She is also a former Wall Street Journal staff writer, blogs at the Rosette Report at PJ Media. Claudia also frequently appears as a foreign policy expert on national and international television radio shows. Claudia, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. Great to be here.
Also joining us is Niall Gardner, director of the Heritage Foundation's Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom. Niall specializes in the Anglo-American Special Relationship, the UN, post-war Iraq, and other issues. He recently was named one of the 50 most influential Britons in the United States by the London Daily Telegraph. Prior to joining Heritage in 2002, Gardner was foreign policy researcher for former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. He is also a prolific writer of articles on national security and appears frequently on foreign policy as a foreign policy expert on national and international television radio shows. And I'm sure you know Niall and Claudia very well because they're on Fox News all the time, and they really know this stuff. Niall, welcome.
Thanks very much, Fred. Great to be here, and thank you for the very kind invitation from the
I want to make just a couple more comments just to let you know that although things look bad, there has been some good news, maybe not bad news, I wanted to stress. The cabinet choices for Biden could have been worse. Susan Rice could have been named Secretary of State. Adam Schiff wanted to be Director of National Intelligence. Fortunately, that didn't happen. Pete Buttigieg could have been Secretary of Defense. So I think we should count our blessings. It isn't worse. Samantha Power might have been Secretary of State. Now she is going to be heading the U.S. Agency for International Development. And when she goes for confirmation, there's going to be real questions about the role she played in abusing U.S. intelligence to unmask members of the Trump campaign. I'm looking forward to that hearing. Some of the things we heard in the confirmation hearings were promising. I was glad when Antony Blinken, the nominee to be Secretary of State, said some good things about President Trump's policy on China. He said that the Biden administration will not move the U.S. embassy from Israel. So again, we have to count our blessings. Things are not all bad, but there were so many bad things that came up. For example, General Austin and the nominee to be Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, would not call China an adversary. They insisted on calling it a competitor. China's not a competitor. France is a competitor. China is an adversary. Some would say an enemy. And if this is the opening position by two separate cabinet nominees on China, I think it goes to show how this administration really underestimates the existential threat posed to our country by China and the Chinese Communist Party. It seems pretty clear that this administration is determined to rejoin the nuclear deal with Iran, regardless of whether Iran comes into compliance with the agreement. I think the evidence is very clear. It has never complied. And Iran is so sure of this, it's issued a set of preconditions that it wants the U.S. to meet before nuclear talks begin. And concerning climate change, I was just listening to a press conference by the Biden climate czar, John Kerry, just a little while ago. It's pretty clear that this is going to be the most important issue, the priority issue above all others for this administration. That Kerry is going to have significant influence with the president, not just on climate issues. And I worry we are going to trade away security equities and other equities because of Biden's obsession with getting some type of climate agreement, not just the Paris Climate Accord. So I'm sorry I have to give you a pessimistic readout, but I'm trying to tell it like it is. And I will hand it over to Claudia, and she will depress you some more.
Yeah, well, let's start with the good things. There are a few. One is that Taiwan was invited to the inauguration, which is important as a show of that we care about what happens to free China, democratic Taiwan. The words from our now Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, about sticking with the building on the Abraham Accords, taking into account the work done on China. These are all things that sound like they're aware, at least, of some of the things that need doing. So there are some signs there to work with. That said, the rest of the picture fills me with concern. It's pretty dismal. On the Middle East, if the administration is determined to try and go back into the Iran deal, as they have said, that basically pulls the underpinnings out from under the Abraham Accords, which were a very significant achievement. The thing is, that depends on a coalition to face down Iran. There was a tremendous common interest there. The Iran deal, for anyone who watched them, the Obama administration sort of wrestled that through over more than a year, was tremendously advantageous to Iran. It's very hard to see exactly how they would negotiate anything that got better terms for the United States, or how that even works. And simply the intent undermines America's allies in the Middle East, who were willing to say, okay, we'll go along with the Abraham Accords. This is interesting. We'll make common cause with Israel. So there's great trouble coming there, I think. My biggest concerns are about China, as we sit here doing this virtually because of the coronavirus, which came from China. And there's been a grab bag of gifts already in just the first week from the Biden administration to China. The executive order on banning the use of the phrase China virus I think was extremely ill-advised because fine, if they don't want that terminology in federal documents, let them inform the bureaucracy quietly. But this was a sort of grandstanding declaration, including the intent to chase down hate speech in the private sector, which is threatening in a country we're already wrestling with shunning, cancel culture, censorship, blacklisting, as Fred said. And the problem there is it basically defers to the propaganda and demands of China's Communist Party. You know, I'm fine with calling it the Communist Chinese Party virus, the CCP virus, but we do need to be aware that it came from China. We do need to be aware that it originated in Wuhan. On climate, the great peril there is whatever you make of the science, which I think is still highly debatable, but another area of cancel culture. Let's assume that they're right about the science, and I don't agree with that. But the problem there is, again, that's a gift to China. To go right back into the Paris Climate Accord, as the executive decree did on, Biden did by executive decree last week on his first day, both brings us back into a non-binding agreement that greatly favors China, which is not under, each country sort of declares what it's going to do under this agreement. China has declared that it's going to start reducing carbon emissions by 2030. And then the promise out there, if you believe this, you'll believe that the moon is made of cheese, that by 2060 there'll be carbon zero, carbon neutral, whatever. What this really amounts to is tremendous pressure and pretext in the US to choke our own economy in the interest of so-called unity with China. I'm further concerned about the scrapping of the Keystone Pipeline, which feeds right into that. Energy independence has been a really basic security goal for a long time. We've achieved it. Okay, this is from Canada, but effectively, this is something that was important not only for jobs, but for the security of the United States. That's now just been scrapped at a blow. Again, China must be delighted. They can now get that Canadian oil. There's a whole set of other things, but back into the United Nations is also a great concern. We went back in, as Brett Schaefer of the Heritage Foundation just wrote, and he's so right, with no conditions imposed. We simply went back in. Trump's withdrawal had gotten us potentially a lot of leverage to demand things. I wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal last fall saying that there should be, one of the conditions should be the resignation of the clearly pro-China director who was complicit in the cover-up of the beginnings of this pandemic. None of that was asked for. There are plans now to go back into very likely a number of other UN entities. They want America back on the Human Rights Council, possibly back into UNESCO, with funding for the Palestinians. President Trump had defunded UNRWA. We're now seeing the Biden administration saying that the PLO can reopen its mission in Washington. So there's a whole set of things here that can only embolden enemies of America at a time when America has plenty of internal problems to worry about. My fear is we're going to look up from the internal quarrels and something truly catastrophic will be coming down upon us, as if the virus last year wasn't enough. So that's my, I'm very worried that for all the promises and words, we will see a performance that goes the very opposite direction, more in keeping with what I think was disastrous foreign policy of the Obama administration. So with that cheerful picture, thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. So Niall, maybe you could weigh in and give us your perspective.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much, Fred, and thank you, Claudia, for your excellent remarks just now. And just a few thoughts on, the big picture foreign policy outlook and landscape over the course of the next 4 years. And also, I'd like to address the issue of transatlantic relations under a Obama presidency and Obama's approach towards the EU and the UK. And also like to talk a bit about the Iran nuclear deal as well, which is a huge issue for the transatlantic alliance. And as Claudia pointed out, I can't say that I have a great deal of confidence in the prognosis for the next 4 years under Biden presidency, because I think that there are a lot of similarities between the path that Biden is taking and the path that Barack Obama took, and not least because Biden has so many Obama staffers around him. Of course, he was vice president during the Obama years, and so Joe Biden owns the Obama foreign policy over the course of 8 years, and that policy was frankly a complete and utter disaster. And we're likely to see a return to that approach, an approach of American weakness on the international stage, an unwillingness to act where necessary, a great deal of hesitation. And there's a great deal of criticism of the Trump administration's foreign policy. But the reality is that over the course of the last 4 years, US leadership on the world stage was far stronger than it was under Barack Obama. And if you look, for example, at the tremendous achievements made by the Trump presidency in the Middle East with regard to the signing of the historic Abraham Accords, I was there at the White House to witness that. That was a groundbreaking development that significantly enhances the long-term peace, prosperity, and security of our allies and partners in the Middle East. And the Trump presidency achieved what no previous US president was able to do, and strike this tremendous, or help Israel to strike this tremendous deal actually with the Gulf states, which significantly enhances the security of the region. Also, we saw the elimination of the ISIS caliphate in Iraq and Syria. That was a huge achievement. ISIS is not completely 100% defeated yet, but it lost 98% of its territory in Iraq and Syria. President Trump basically finished the half-hearted job, perhaps that was started by President Obama. He completed that very successfully by the maximum application of US power and influence in the region, and that's a big achievement actually. ISIS is still, of course, a danger, as a threat, but it doesn't control the kind of territory it used to control. And US leadership really did matter in making that a reality. Also, if you look at the big picture in terms of the NATO alliance, I would argue that NATO is significantly stronger today than it was 4 years ago. And that's because almost every single NATO partner has pledged to increase its defense spending. We're already seeing many NATO allies increasing defense spending. Even the Germans are pledging to increase defense spending, which frankly would have been regarded as an absolute miracle 5 years ago, but that's a reality today. And so President Trump's pressure on our NATO allies to actually invest more in the collective defense of NATO, that approach actually really did pay off. And sometimes you've got to be tough with your friends and partners, and you've got to send a message that they've all got to step up to the plate, and they've got to fulfill their agreed pledges to spend at least 2% of GDP on defense. And NATO is stronger today than it was several years ago. There are more US troops on the ground on the eastern flank of Europe than there were several years ago. You now have US forces based in the Baltic states. You have a permanent US military base being built now in Poland. And of course, Poland is an absolutely vital ally for the United States. And this whole idea that over the last few years, the US has abandoned its allies, that it's thrown its allies under the bus, is really frankly complete nonsense. And that's a big part of the kind of Biden narrative. And in reality, if you look at the key alliances that the US has on the international stage, the NATO alliance, the US-UK special relationship, the partnership with India, the partnership with Israel, the partnership with Japan, these partnerships are all stronger today than they were under Barack Obama, and that is the reality. And it's certainly my fear that under a Biden presidency, we're going to see a very different kind of approach being taken. I mean, firstly, I think in the Middle East, a far weaker US footprint in that region. Biden will be far less willing to commit US military power against our adversaries in the region. He's pledged to return to the appalling failure, the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. It's one of the worst agreements signed in modern times, frankly. And it is an appeasement deal towards Iran. It's a very good deal for the Iranians, which is why they want the deal resurrected. And Biden is basically pledging to return to that deal. And that would be a disastrous move. That would definitely throw Israel under the bus. It would throw our Gulf partners under the bus as well. It would strengthen the Iranian regime. So any kind of lifting of US sanctions would be hugely counterproductive. And I think that what we're seeing already from the Biden presidency is the Obama Mark II foreign policy, which really left the world in a far more dangerous position, frankly, and undermined US security. And so that's certainly the trend that we are seeing. And I think that Joe Biden views US leadership as some kind of popularity contest on the world stage, where he wants to be loved and adored by the European elites, for example, sitting in Brussels. That kind of approach, sounds very nice to the liberal upper class, but the reality is that approach is dangerous. It reeks of appeasement, and the last thing you want to do is align US foreign policy together with that of the European Union, because the European Union's policy on the Iran front, on the China front, etc., is one of frankly complete surrender. And we saw that with the EU-China investment agreement that was unveiled just a couple of weeks ago, which basically gives everything that China wanted on a plate. And this was a deal struck without any consultation with the United States, either the Trump presidency or the incoming Biden team. In fact, it blindsided the Biden team. And the EU is determined to follow a path of developing a very close partnership with China. Now, I suspect there are many officials in the Biden presidency who would be willing to go along with that line. And that would be a huge mistake. And I think that one of the biggest successes of the Trump presidency of foreign policy was the willingness to stand up to China, to treat China not as a friend, as a partner, but as an adversary. And as a former US ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, said this morning on Fox News, she said, China is the #1 adversary for the United States on the international stage. China is the #1 enemy for the US on the world stage. And we have to treat China like the enemy it is. It's not a potential partner. It's not a golfing ally, potentially for Joe Biden. It's an adversary for us, and we've got to treat it as such. And it would be a grave mistake, I think, to reverse course on that position. And it's notable that Joe Biden's nominee for the US ambassador to the United Nations actually spoke at a event hosted by a Confucius Institute a while back, basically praising China's Belt and Road Initiative. That's completely the wrong signal to be sending to China. China is a genocidal regime that puts 1 million Muslim Uyghurs in concentration camps. That's not acceptable today. And we have to stand up to that kind of barbarism that the Chinese government is implementing against its minorities. We cannot treat China as though it's a reasonable diplomatic actor on the international stage. That's not the reality. We have to stand up to China, as we have to stand up as well to Putin's Russia and to the Iranian dictatorship in the Middle East as well. We need strength and resolve on the international stage. The Biden approach, I think, is very high risk. It's very dangerous. Let's not forget as well that Biden he's a big Euro-federalist. He went to the European Parliament back in 2010 as vice president, gave a speech there saying that Brussels could claim to be the leader of the free world. Well, I always thought America was the leader of the free world and not Brussels. And so that basically sums up the Biden approach. And the fact that on day one, President Biden threw a bust of Winston Churchill out of the Oval Office, just as Barack Obama did back in 2009. President Trump brought it back in 2017, and Biden, one of the first things he did on his first day was remove the bust of Churchill. And what kind of message does that send to Great Britain, America's closest friend and ally? Completely the wrong message. And that's a bad omen for this presidency, because if you're removing a bust of a great man who, Winston Churchill, who literally led the free world and stood up to tyranny and evil, a man who basically established a special relationship with the United States. And if Biden is turfing Winston Churchill out of the Oval Office on day one, what kind of message does that send to our partners and allies? It's an appalling message. Unfortunately, I think it's a very worrying sign for the next few years. On that rather pessimistic note, I'm going to hand back over to you, Fred. Thank you.
Thank you, Niall. Before we take questions from the audience, and you can send questions in through your console, I wanted to ask a question about personnel. You know the old adage that personnel is policy, and there's been a number of observations about the kinds of people who Biden has chosen to run his national security. They're generally unremarkable. They've been called Obama retreads. There's no John Foster Dulles or Condoleezza Rice in top jobs, which is a little bit odd. There's also been criticism at the State Department that all the positions, all the top positions, are going to political appointees. The two top positions at the CIA are both political appointees. I might add, I think President Trump made a mistake not putting two political appointees at the CIA, so I give Biden credit for taking control of the agency. But it is interesting how aggressively Biden and his team have been to seize control of the government, to put political loyalists throughout the organization, both to implement his policies and to throw out Trump policies. And one final point before I ask both of you to comment, they're cleaning out the National Security Council. There's people who are on contracts who are not supposed to be let go, who are being let go in droves because they want to fill that building with people who are politically and ideologically close to the president. That's not the way that organization is supposed to work. And if Donald Trump had done that, you can imagine what the media would say. So Claudia, let me start with you. I'm just wondering your general observations about national security personnel that we've seen so far with this administration.
I'm profoundly concerned. I mean, what you've just described, yes, is exactly right. And what Nigel the list that he ran through of very serious concerns is quite real. China is an enemy, not a competitor. And the question becomes sort of what is guiding this show? You have a team, many of the sort of most prominent members of this team, we've already seen in action in a different configuration in the Obama administration, which left the world in such a mess that our American foreign policy in such a mess that when President Trump came in, it was hard to see where he could begin to unravel this thing. I mean, remember, China was on this incredibly aggressive role. The promised pivot had never happened. North Korea was conducting nuclear and ballistic missile tests to beat the band. ISIS was on a roll. It had its caliphate in the Middle East. Iran was on a rampage in the Middle East, and so forth. This was their foreign policy at the time. And okay, Obama was at the top of this. We don't really know what's at the top of this right now. I mean, look, we don't need to question President Biden's mental faculties simply to observe that he doesn't have the energy that he observably did 10 years ago. And this is a team that's going to be forming policy, and it's sort of a collective with promises that everything will be fine, and yet any part of it that you start to look into is very troubling. Can I just take climate just to home in on how are they dealing with this? Climate is potentially an enormous source of wealth for cronies and political pals. Okay, it's tremendous wealth redistribution that goes on. That is something any administration should be aware of. This great emphasis on climate has a further enormous threat. And as everybody starts to talk about climate, equity, all these abstractions, which also figured basically in President Biden's inaugural address, the question is, well, what does that mean in practice? And what it means in practice over and over is US sort of stepping away from real focus on real security threats, which are many right now, especially from China, and tremendous concentration on all these sort of fuzzy and expensive and sometimes very counterproductive
Hey,
ruinous.
Claudia, I'm gonna stop you there because I want to let Niall talk about personnel, and then I want to open it up to questions. I'm sure this question will come up, climate will come up from our audience. And I might add, Niall, another thing I'm observing, not just with John Kerry, but with Susan Rice in the White House, I think there's people advising on national security who we may not be aware of, who may be in the Oval Office fairly frequently, advising the President Biden, pushing him in the wrong direction.
Yeah, that's a great point, Fred. And without a doubt, I mean, this is a highly politicized, national security team that's in place here, they've also basically purged almost everybody who could be identified either with the Trump administration or holding conservative views on foreign policy matters. And so this Biden presidency has moved with ruthless efficiency in terms of basically getting rid of anyone who doesn't align with its views, and it's put in place a very, very liberal foreign policy team, including, of course, with Secretary of State Tony Blinken. And I was just looking at his remarks yesterday. Just reviewing remarks that he had made some time ago, but I was reading them again yesterday, and he was talking about Brexit, and Blinken had been absolutely scathing about Brexit before his appointment, describing it basically as a complete sort of disaster and a mess for Britain and all the rest of it, and a car crash. And these kinds of remarks, and I have to say, are incredibly insulting towards America's closest friend and ally, and zero respect for the democratic will of the British people. And this is the new Secretary of State. These are remarks that would never have been made by any of the last few Secretaries of States. And this is the man who's in charge of the diplomacy of the United States. And so, the Blinken outlook actually is actually, as well, I mean, shared by many other officials within the new national security and foreign policy team of the Biden presidency. This is a presidency that's very hostile towards Brexit, especially. It's very pro-EU. It is, I think, it's going to be much more hardline against Israel as well, actually, very much in favor, as we discussed earlier, of rejoining the Iran nuclear deal. You've seen the return of Wendy Sherman to the administration, who, of course, was the architect of the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear agreement. And so, the architect of the Iran appeasement policy, which the Iranians thought was the greatest thing ever invented, frankly. The architect of that deal is now back in power in the White House, and so Biden is surrounded by.
Sherman will be Deputy Secretary of State.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Right at the very top, or near the very top. And so these are worrying developments, and I know many of my friends in London, for example, are concerned about the direction of some of the policies of this new administration. And I've also spoken to many other allies across Europe as well, who worked closely with the Trump presidency on many issues, who are concerned about the direction this administration is taking. And in my view, in many respects, I mean, the Biden presidency could be the most left-wing U.S. presidency in history. We're seeing that already with all the executive orders, largely focused at the moment, of course, on the domestic policy front, which are, many of them are very extreme. We're looking at, in many respects, a far left presidency ideologically, which is going to be reflected in some areas of foreign policy as well. And that should be a real concern for anyone who cares about the future of the United States and the national security and foreign policy of the United States.
Thank you. Well, I want to bring in my colleague, Adam, right now, and see if he could tell us about any questions we might have from our audience.
We have lots of interesting questions, so I apologize in advance if I don't get to yours. Start out with, will Israel stop sharing some intel due to the presence of a BDS activist as the intel liaison on the national security staff?
Now, what this question is about is that the president has named to head the intelligence program at the NSC someone who is strongly anti-Israel and a supporter of the anti-Israel BDS movement. It's perhaps one of the most appallingly bad appointments by this administration. And I think Republicans and Democrats are going to be outraged by it. So this is an interesting question. Will Israel trust this administration in terms of intelligence sharing if this character is overseeing intelligence programs from the National Security Council? And my position is that probably Israel is going to cut back sharing intelligence. What do you folks think?
I think that's right. I mean, we don't know we don't have an inside track on what they're going to do, but how can they carry on with this knowledge? You know, Fred, there's so much with the intelligence community that's been profoundly troubling for some time. And part of it is the carryover from the Obama administration, right down to Samantha Power's use of the unmasking ability, where we still haven't had an accounting of why she did hundreds of those. And yes, her confirmation hearing will be interesting, but on many fronts, the question, the very troubling question right now is what use will be made of intelligence at this point. So the Israelis have a real worry there, I think.
Sure.
Yes, and I agree, and I think that there's a real possibility of a fundamental lack of trust actually in the Biden presidency on the part of the Israeli administration. I think with good reason. If you look at some of the appointments that are coming in, and I closely followed the issue of U.S.-Israel relations during the Obama years, and those were very, very tense years in terms of the U.S.-Israel partnership. And in my view, President Obama treated Benjamin Netanyahu in an extremely rude and appalling fashion, actually. And it would be terrible if we saw a return to that kind of approach today being taken by the White House. And there should be no place for officials in the Biden presidency who believe in boycotting Israel, our closest friend and partner in the Middle East. And what kind of message does that send actually? And so the Biden White House needs to wake up on these issues, and it would be very damaging, I think, for the United States to begin the Biden presidency undermining one of our closest friends and partners in the world, the people of Israel, and I think that a move like this, bringing on board pro divestment BDS figures would be a very dangerous step actually, and it's simply shocking actually that the White House is even considering this kind of appointment.
I want to ask the two of you a question based on something that Claudia said that's very important, and that's the role of intelligence in this administration. We're actually hearing calls by Obama officials and the left to use our intelligence agencies against the American people to crush dissent. And John Brennan recently said that our intelligence agencies are working hard to go after insurrectionists and haters and bigots and libertarians. I kid you not. He actually said this in an MSNBC interview. This is just frightening. And I think there is a real possibility that our intelligence agencies will be looking over online conversations and speeches, things we say on television, and it will be used to at least get us kicked offline. Maybe investigations, maybe prosecutions and arrests, I don't know. But the prospect after our intelligence agencies were abused against the Trump campaign, and now we're looking at a wider use of our intelligence agencies against the American people for holding politically incorrect views, is really chilling. And I don't think it's an exaggeration. I don't think it's something we should just brush off. But anyway, that's where I am. What do you folks think?
I I think that unity is being greatly twisted and is much overrated, okay? And this is something that comes from the left. And as I hear this endless unity, which is what is supposed to be propelling all this, we're all supposed to agree now. We're not supposed to have these, what are now regarded as dangerously dissenting views. Unity is also something you hear endlessly from China right now, a shared future for mankind. And the point that I think needs making a lot, until they shut people down, and even then, is our system, yes, it's from many one, but it is not based on unity. It's based on competition among political parties, in the marketplace of ideas, in markets, in so many dimensions. And whenever you hear this unity, the question is unity on whose terms, on what terms? And this has just gone missing. We're all being told, if you don't agree, you must be dangerous, you must be wrong. And I see this on the international front in this sort of, we all must join. Again, that's sort of the idea with the climate policy is, oh, well, this will be common ground with China. No, it won't. China is using climate as one of the things to peddle Belt and Road. I mean, it's all a phony facade, but it's something where join the green initiative, which isn't actually green. But is simply sign on to the collective, join this mass. It's the kind of thing that George Orwell was warning us against almost a century ago, except now the technology is real. And it's very worrying. And I think it's important to keep putting out the message in any way possible and reminding our foreign diplomats and the administration that, as you said, Fred, unity with the world is not actually what we need. It's not safe. It's very dangerous. Think of this as the 1930s, 21st century style. Unity did not work out. There are players where you can't unify. The points of disagreement go to the very core of our freedoms, our rights, what makes America a great nation. So that's
sounds good. I want to ask now quickly, because I want to get to more questions. Are you concerned about our intelligence agencies being used to spy on the American people under this administration?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think that it's you raise a bigger issue here about distinguishing between cracking down on you have violent extremists who will be dealt with by the intelligence services and so on. But there's a broader question of whether or not intelligence services may be used against people just for expressing opinions and going for individuals based upon their thoughts rather than actions and so on. And I think that you raise very legitimate questions there, which is a part of a broader debate. And I was watching the other day analyst on CNN talking about the need for Fox News and Newsmax and conservative news sites basically to be closed down. Basically, you're saying that they should be deplatformed really, and that that they should be taken off the cable channels basically. And this is exactly the kind of language that we're seeing from the from dictatorial regimes like the Putin regime, for example. Basically suppressing opposition voices and so on. This is very dangerous stuff. And I saw a piece in the Washington Post a few days ago, which basically saying the same kind of thing, saying that Fox News should is behind insurrection and all the rest of it. Complete nonsense. And so this is a very dangerous path that the left is going down, and they're copying the tactics used by the Putinistas in Russia, for example, to try and close down media outlets. And so there's a whole much bigger debate here about about freedom of speech and the left's attempts to suppress freedom of speech, which I think is an extremely an important issue actually for the American people to be aware of.
Sounds good. Adam?
Niall mentioned that some U.S. troops are moving east in Europe, but the bulk are still in Germany and Western Europe. Will we ever fully disentangle from NATO countries that don't really welcome us and are no longer strategic?
Yeah, that's a good that's a good question, and I think that under the Trump presidency we saw the the emphasis in European security upon the defense of the eastern flank, basically, which was the defense of the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and also Poland. And so that's where I think the Trump presidency had its main focus in terms of building up a US military presence. We saw the redeployment of some forces from Western Europe to Eastern Europe. And I think that actually sent the right message to the Putin regime. But at the same time, if you look at the Baltic states and the Poles and the Eastern European countries, they're willing to really fight and defend the NATO alliance, and they're willing to fight to the death to defend their countries and the NATO eastern flank. And unfortunately, many in Western Europe, and opinion polls show this, are not willing to fight at all. And you look at opinion polls in Germany, for example, and a lot of Germans are not willing at all to defend the NATO alliance. And some of them, believe that we should be friendly with Putin and with the Chinese as well. And so they're very worrying trends in Europe, a kind of rising pacifism that you see across Western Europe, a willingness to embrace tyrannies like Putin's Russia and the Communist Party in Beijing. And unfortunately, a lot of this thinking percolates right to the very top of the Euro elites as well. And so, so I think that the message has to be sent to all of our European allies that they've got to be willing to defend their own countries, and they've got to be willing to invest in their own defense. And that has to be the message that is, that is sent. And NATO is not a charity. NATO is an alliance of nation states standing together for the common defense. But everyone's got to step up to the plate. Everyone's got to be willing to defend their own countries. And what we're seeing from many in Western Europe, and not in Eastern Europe, but Western Europe, is growing anti-Americanism, a kind of welfare mindset when it comes to defense issues, and a complete dependence upon the US military umbrella. Well, it is time for them to be prepared to stand shoulder to shoulder with US and British forces to defend the eastern flank of NATO against the Russian bear. But I have to say that and the opinion polls do demonstrate this, that we are seeing a growing appeasement mentality in Western Europe. We're seeing growing anti-Americanism, and we're seeing a growing pacifism there. And if they continue with this kind of pacifist course, one day they're going to be living under Russian occupation if they want to continue.
I'm going to stop you there because I want to keep this focused on the Biden administration. Yeah. Adam, do you have any questions about China? I think that's an issue that a lot of our supporters are very concerned about regarding Biden.
A reporter asked in press briefing about an EO giving China access to our electrical grid. There was no cogent answer. Who in the federal government will stand up for the USA if Biden gives China too much?
Huge question, big problem. Look, that executive order said that they're Biden immediately on day one overturned Trump's order that China be kept out of the US power grid, which is terribly important. And this is now being reviewed by the Energy Department and the Office of Management and Budget, which sort of takes it out of the security realms, which is the big concern here. And that's just a tremendous concern, and I'm not seeing any place likely to stand up for it. It was the president who signed the executive order. At the State Department, the Trump State Department under Mike Pompeo, who did a brilliant job. Toward the end, President Trump had assembled a superb team on China, and they were putting out very important information and statements. They were so good that one of the brilliant, articulate China genuine experts I most respect, although I think we disagree on US domestic politics, Perry Link, wrote a piece for the New York Review of Books saying that President Biden would be wise to retain some of the Trump team on China. They were that good. Well, they're gone. And on the State Department website under Tony Blinken, where under Mike Pompeo, there was one of the prime items was the China challenge that is now erased. It's gone. And So for everything from what now happens with the power grid to this review that's been ordered, an interagency review of all the various restrictions that President Trump imposed on China. I don't think it's likely that they're going to come up with more when they're done with it. I think it's likely they're going to start pulling some of them back. It's a very dangerous time, and it's just so important to keep a focus on exactly how predatory China really is at this point. You know, President Xi Jinping, we should really call him General Secretary Xi Jinping. That's his important job, the head of the military commission there in the Communist Party, has told the Chinese people, we must be on a war footing. We have to be ready at any time for war. He's preparing for war. We saw an enormous military parade on the 70th anniversary of China in 2019. That's a message, and it's a threat. It's real. It's getting bigger as we go. What they're doing at the United Nations is basically ingesting the place, sort of turning it to China's uses. It's becoming a marketing arm of China's Belt and Road in many respects. That's part of the whole climate thing. So who in the administration is going to put a check on that? One of the problems with the wholesale purge that's now going on is that the voices that would have suggested govern with some sort of something that's not simply a hardline left agenda with real moderation, those people are gone. And we now have a team where Tony Blinken has said he's going to, you know, be careful and build on some of the successes. But we're not really seeing signs coming from the White House that that's how it's going to work. And as for Jake Sullivan at the National Security Council,
we got to stop there because I want to get in another question.
Yeah.
Adam, we have to stop at 2. Do you have other questions to put forward?
Yeah, so there are several along the lines of Biden is an empty suit. Who's really pulling the strings? One mentions is Kamala Harris doing it, but she doesn't really have foreign policy experience, and would point out that Richard Grenell openly called out Susan Rice, saying she might be pulling the string. So, if anyone would like to comment on that? Any conjecture on that?
I think Biden is pushing his own agenda for foreign policy with the group of advisors that have been around him for a long time. So, but I got to tell you, as I watched John Kerry this morning doing a press conference on climate change, I mean, it's just night and day between Kerry's ability to speak coherently and give detailed answers to questions and explanations to the president. I don't know if that's going to affect his decision making on foreign policy, but it does raise questions about how reliant is he going to be on some of these advisors in the White House. How often is Susan Rice going to be in his office whispering in his ear?
If I may just jump in on Susan Rice, I need to make a catty remark here. There were 5 of her for Benghazi. So on every news talk show. So she's got lots of resources to deploy there. And I think that this talk of equity, which has now replaced equality, equality implied just one standard of justice for all. Equity is basically more in the line of communist redistribution, which involves enormous state power and repression. That's going down a very bad road. That affects foreign policy. The US economy affects foreign policy. The fact that we are now heading into bitter fights because the Biden administration is not governing to the center. They're immediately heading to hard left domestically, and I think instilling great fear in many quarters. All of that is a tremendous distraction from real threats abroad. The threat is not the American people. And Susan Rice is right there. Her thing is foreign policy. She has been a disaster. This is there's a leading from behind to the Benghazi, the videos, to the whole role of the National Security Council. We now have Jake Sullivan, where I was just going to say, I'm encouraged that he's doing a webinar with Robert O'Brien, President Trump's final foreign policy advisor, who was spectacularly good on China on Friday. But Jake Sullivan was one of the leading people to get the Iran nuclear deal rolling. And what Nigel said on that is right. That was absolute a disaster. So there are all sorts of influences in the White House that right now are showing up in very, very troubling ways, rather than what we really need to see at this point. What I hope they end up heading toward, I don't see a sign of it so far, in that is govern toward the center. Pay attention to the real threats in the real world. Your problem is not the American people. Your problem is a rising China in cahoots with what I call a conglomerate of evil, with Russia, with the Iranians, and with North Korea. Remember them? You know. So anyway, Nigel.
I want to ask a final question of Niall, and I'm wondering, as someone who was born in Britain, what do you think the Europeans really think about Joe Biden, and what do they think they can accomplish with him on foreign policy?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and of course, Joe Biden has been welcomed by the EU ruling elites as a sort of returning messiah, basically, and so there's lots of adoration for Biden. But if you look under the surface, I think that the EU today is moving in a very distinct trajectory. The European Union, especially as far as say, for example, Emmanuel Macron views it, seeks to become more independent. It has delusions of grandeur to be some kind of military power. And as we saw with the EU-China investment agreement, the EU is willing to knife even the Biden administration in the back in order to kowtow to China. And so it'll serve its, the EU will do what it's in its own perceived interest. And so you're going to see significantly, I think, on the surface, lots of words of praise for Joe Biden from European leaders, but behind the scenes, you're going to see some tensions there. You're going to see the Euros throwing Biden under the bus, when it suits them. And Emmanuel Macron, he made some very important remarks, I think, back last December ahead of the NATO leaders meeting in London, where he basically said that there should be a European Union army to challenge, he said, not only China and Russia, but also America, he said. And this is where a lot of the thinking is among the kind of the Euro federalists. That's not necessarily where Angela Merkel is, but she's about to depart. She's going to be replaced, or she's already been replaced for the leadership of the CDU by a pro-Putin figure. I think this is going to be a very, very interesting few years on the transatlantic alliance. And although Biden worships the European Union and he's a Euro federalist, he's going to find that Europe today is changing very, very rapidly, and he shouldn't forget that his America's closest friend and ally in Europe is going to be Great Britain, now outside of the EU, fortunately, thankfully, due to Brexit, and also, of course, countries like Poland as well, very strong US allies. But if he thinks he can trust Brussels and the European Commission and so on, then he's I think Biden is frankly dreaming or delusional.
Well, Noah Gardner and Claudia Rosette, thank you so much for a fascinating discussion of where it looks like Biden national security policy is going after week one. As I said at the beginning, elections have consequences, and our task right now is to press the Biden administration to make the best policies possible to secure our freedom and security, and to scrutinize these policies and hold the Biden administration responsible. I know that's what the Heritage Foundation is doing. I'm sure that's what the Independent Women's Forum is doing, and the Center for Security Policy is very aggressive right now in doing this. And one thing is, we want to make sure we get these messages to Congress, and we'll be sending links of this webinar to members of Congress so they can listen to this conversation. Hopefully that will help them press the Biden administration to make wise decisions to keep our nation safe and secure. So with that, I'm going to sign off and hand it over to Adam Savitt.
Yes, just a reminder about upcoming programs. Remember, all of these are Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Next week, February 3rd, strategically anchoring the eastern end of the Abraham Accords, the role of India, Japan, and Australia, featuring Harold Rode of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, David Goldman of the Asia Times, hosted by our own David Wormser. Then February 10th, The Fate of Immigration and Border Security under a Biden Administration, featuring Laura Reese of Heritage, Todd Bensman of the Center for Immigration Studies, and the center's Kyle Scheidler will be moderating. And then February 17th, Taiwan at a Crossroads, Growing Military and Ideological Threats, featuring our two CSP fellows, Stephen Bryan and Grant Newsom. And I will be moderating that program. I'm excited to say that's part of our new China project at the center. Every fourth webinar will be China focused, and we'll have more details on that project going forward. With that, thank you for joining the Center for Security Policy. Enjoy the rest of your day. We'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much. Thank you.